Chapter 15, Section 4, Secession and War. So we're going to go over the homework that I assigned here in class, the guided reading, and then the reteaching. So this screencast is going to cover most of just the guided reading. If you have any particular questions, most of them are repetitive on this part, so I just wanted you to kind of practice in the writing of it. So the first part talks about the presidential election of 1860, and I'm going to kind of cover this quickly because we've already gone over it and no need to kind of bore you with the same material. So as we look here in this first box, I have not highlighted the answers as I'm going to as the rest of the sheet, but the issue of slavery. The issue of slavery caused the Democrats to split, and before the election of 1860, the northern wing of the Democratic Party chose this man, Stephen Douglas, and they endorsed the issue of popular sovereignty over here. And then the southern Democrats, on the other hand, they chose this man. This would be John Breckinridge. And then finally, the Republicans are going to choose Abraham Lincoln. So that's this first paragraph here. The only candidate that's not discussed is sort of the middle ground candidate. So we had gone over these. These are the various ones. And John Bell was the one not mentioned on the sheet there. But here you can sort of see the candidates in the election of 1860. And it's going to be that crucial election because it's going to pretty much push the ball rolling towards eventual secession and then the outbreak of actual hostilities. So as we talk about that, we discussed that the Republicans, of course, win the election of 1860. That happens in November. Then we move forward into what happens in reaction to that, and that is the South begins the process of secession, or secede, meaning they leave or they basically withdraw. So on so we're going to go to December 20th, 1860, South Carolina votes to secede from the Union. All right, and so if you were alive at the time, you would see a heading like this if you lived in Charleston, South Carolina, and you can sort of see down here, you can sort of see the words unanimously, which means there is every single person is in agreement in their legislature. That occurs December 20th at 1860, and they dissolve the union between the state of South Carolina and that thing known as the Constitution of the United States, in which they joined. So jumping back here, we get to that second one here in the second paragraph, number 6. As other southern states debated secession, Senator, and the answer there would be John Crittenden, and here is John Crittenden of Kentucky, proposed a plan to protect slavery as a last-minute compromise, sometimes referred to as the compromise, Crittenden's compromise. But it basically is rejected. And then we move down here to number 7. He wanted to keep slavery protected in the areas of 3630 North. Pretty much like bringing back the old Missouri Compromise, but both sides rejected it. And John Crittenden becomes a very good example of what happened in the Civil War. He had 2 sons. One son would fight for the North and one son would fight for the South. So you could sort of see it even split the houses of even the highest elected official. So as time goes on, by February of 1861, there are 2 more states that basically also secede. So you can have them in either way. The answer would be either Texas or Georgia. It doesn't matter the order. I will show you the order in which it happens. Actually, Texas becomes one of the last of the original 7 states to secede. So the seceded states call themselves, and the answer to that would, of course, be the Confederate States of America. So if we look here, we can sort of see the pattern by which the states had seceded. So you can sort of see their numbers underneath. So South Carolina being the first and Texas being the last. Now this is a very short video that I'm going to share afterwards, so I'd like you to watch that. Basically just setting up the whole premise of how the southern states seceded and how that led to Civil War. What happens next is, now that you have 7 states, the Confederacy as a government and as what they would refer to as a country begins to form. They create a flag. It looks somewhat like the American flag with the same colors. You now understand why there are 7 stars here. They represent those early 7 states that seceded. So what happens next? Of course, they name themselves the Confederate States of America. Remember, we discussed something that had the word Confederate in it, or Confederation, and that goes way back to the beginning of our studies where we talked about the first Constitution, known as the Articles of Confederation. And the reason why they picked that word, Confederate, is because it deals with the idea of a loose association where states hold the most power. not in which they were part of the United States, where a lot of power was centralized. All right, let's jump back to this. So moving on here to who do they elect as their president, and the person that they elect is Jefferson Davis was his name, and here's Jefferson Davis. Now Jefferson Davis is he was a member of a former cabinet. He is a former senator. He was a senator from Mississippi. He is a Mexican war veteran, and he was basically told that he was picked as the president of the Confederacy. He and Lincoln are both born in Kentucky, about 100 miles apart, but Lincoln's family would eventually move towards Illinois, and Davis's party and family would move towards the South. Number 12, the theory of states' rights basically allowed Southerners to justify their idea of secession. They felt that since their rights had been violated, they could then leave the Union. And then finally, in his inaugural address, finally in March, back in the day, presidents didn't take office until March. And so Lincoln comes in and he basically disagrees that Southern states can even secede. He says they're not going to be permitted to do that. And then he vows to hold on to federal property. Okay, federal property is the answer for that one. Okay, so moving on to that, we have to at least address this flag, because so many kids, and of course in modern times, this is a flag that engenders so much feelings and animosity. It's a flag of terrorism to some, and the idea of history to others, but you have to understand that this is a flag that was originally a battle flag used by the Confederates, not introduced until 1862. And you can sort of see that there's actually 13 stars here, and no, they do not represent the 13 original colonies. They actually, there were only 11 states in the Confederacy, but we'll get back to that idea of the other two later on. So Jefferson Davis is picked as the president, and here is a picture from his inauguration here in Montgomery, Alabama. And so he is sworn in as the first and, of course, only president of the Confederacy. So we're here at the bottom of this second paragraph, and the one that we haven't answered pretty much is basically Lincoln's idea that he is going to hold on to that federal property, and let's just talk about that. So here is the way it would have looked in 1861 at Lincoln's first inauguration. They actually inaugurated on the other side of the Capitol than they do presently. And yes, the Capitol Rotunda was still in the process of being completed. So what his reaction was is there were federal forts throughout the South that Confederate forces and Confederate governments had seized. And so what his plan was, and his pledge, was to hold on to them. The problem is he did not want to start any kind of fighting or violence. And so in southern states, where Confederates would approach various federal forts and say, this is no longer U.S. property, you need to evacuate and leave, all of the commanders, all of the troops had to make the decision to either stay and fight with the Confederacy or leave and return back to their home state. So Lincoln then, of course, learns that there's only really one other state and one other fort that actually is still in federal hands, and that is down in South Carolina at Fort Sumter. So looking at the last one here with Fort Sumter, Confederate troops demand the surrender of Fort Sumter, a United States fort on an island guarding, and the answer for 14 is Charleston Harbor up there. So if we take a look here, this is the way Fort Sumter would have looked in 1861. It is a masonry fort. Okay, the sides are not made of wood, they're made of stone. It is on a man-made island in Charleston Harbor, about 1 mile from the downtown area. It was started after the War of 1812 and was not about 90% complete in 1860. So what had happened is when South Carolina voted to secede, the men that were loyal to the Union in the various forts around the city quietly kind of evacuated themselves out to Fort Sumter, and there they kind of were by themselves from Christmas Day pretty much all the way up until past Lincoln's inauguration and into the month of April. So the next slide just basically kind of covers the same things I just mentioned. There it is in South Carolina, and there you can see Charleston and where it's located. So let's get back to this. So in response, Lincoln sends a unarmed expedition with much needed supplies to the fort. And so what he was pretty much doing was, as he said, he's going to leave the decision to start shooting up to the Confederates, meaning he informed the governor of the state, I believe, and the mayor of the city of Charleston that he was sending an unarmed, basically humanitarian mission filled with just necessary supplies, and pretty much decided to let the Confederates decide if they were going to let the fort be resupplied, which they didn't, or not. He did not want to be the aggressor. He did not want to be the belligerent person starting the fight. He realized that if it was going to happen, the Confederates would have to be the ones to actually begin it. So, on April 12, 1861, Confederate guns opened fire on the fort. So if we look here, there's Fort Sumter. So these other forts were in existence at the time, Fort Moultrie being the biggest one. And when I talked about the idea of them kind of quietly evacuating, that's exactly what they did. So Fort Sumter was pretty much put there to guard and protect from foreign invaders. They really never thought that the city that they were protecting would be the ones firing cannons at them on that April morning in 1861. So if you were alive, this is what it would look like. Okay, you can sort of see the Confederates firing shot at the fort, and yes, some of them things caught on fire because there were some structures inside made of wood. They held out for 33 hours, and eventually they do surrender. But again, this is what you'd see if you were around in 1861. These would be Confederate forces firing over a mile to hit the fort out there in the middle of the harbor. More scenes. This would be, of course, inside Fort Sumter. You can sort of see these are actual tracks. So when the gun fires, you sort of see the wheel. Of course, it would push back. You'd have that kind of rollback, and so that was inside the fort. But no one dies actually in it, and you can sort of see now the flag is flown over Fort Sumter because the Union had surrendered. They were allowed to leave the fort, get on ships, and leave South Carolina. These next pictures are just the fort today. I have been down to South Carolina. I have not had the pleasure of going out to Fort Sumter yet, but it is about a 2 or 3 hour expedition because the boat ride is between 20 and 30 minutes, but then you go inside and you can sort of see there is a large museum. You can actually tour the fort, all that type of stuff. So you can sort of see the way it looks today. I always like to tell this story about Fort Sumter and the people. The man inside the fort was this guy, Major Robert Anderson, and he's, I believe, from Kentucky. And then you had PGT Beauregard. You're probably thinking, what do all these letters stand for? Well, this man is a Creole, and he's from Louisiana, and he's in some ways very French in his background. So his name actually stands for Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. And the story is that this was the man inside, and then this was the man outside leading Confederate forces. The interesting story is that Anderson was a teacher at West Point. And one of the things that he taught was none other than artillery, like firing cannons at various structures. And the one person that he kept on as a great student was none other than PGT Beauregard. So they're now on opposite sides of this conflict. So you can look up online, and there's actually dispatches between both men that are very nice and very cordial, basically talking about are you going to surrender and so forth and so on. But they're still in the historical record, and you can see. So let's finish things up here. So following the attack, President Lincoln calls for, and the answer is 75,000 troops to fight to save the Union. They're supposed to only serve for about 90 days. So what you have next are all these various ads go up throughout the North to basically encourage people to sign up. So here you can sort of see this is from Maine. I'm trying to think where that, New Hampshire. Okay, sort of see New Jersey. Okay. This one, I'm not really sure. I'm looking here. But the idea is you can sort of see this is what happens next. Now, fast forward 4 years later after the end of the war. It's April 14th, 1865. Here's a cool stunner. Fort Sumter is going to raise the American flag again, the same one that was taken down 4 years before on April 14th, 1861. And so they are going to raise the flag again over Fort Sumter, and President Lincoln is invited to attend. But here's the catch. He decides not to go because he's going to see a play that night. at Ford's Theater. So amazingly, how history would be different if he had gone down to Sumter to see the Fort Sumter flag raised again. So there we come to a close of 15-4. We'll pick up with the other worksheet in a different screencast.